Okay, in Chapter 2, we're going to take a look at neuroscience and its relationship to behavior. Now, this chapter here, discusses, in relation to neuroscience, we're going to take a look, talk about the human brain quite a bit. So just wanted to give you a heads up that there will be some, science-related stuff in this chapter. So the first thing we need to know is that there are different types of neurons in the human brain. There are sensory neurons, motor neurons, and interneurons. So neurons, basically what they are the pathway where neuroelectrical impulses travel. And I just consider, even though it's not exactly true, but I always say that, think of, the neuron here as basically, it's comprised of a bunch of different parts. There's a cell body here, then there's the axon, which is this long part right here. It's kind of like an electrical wire right here. And then on the very end, there's these little branch-like things, and those are called dendrites. Okay, so we'll take a look at those a little more in depth, but feel free to pause this video at any time. What's important about this slide right here, though, is, there's different types of neurons. Sensory neurons, they communicate information from the environment to our central nervous system. And the central nervous system is our brain and our spinal cord. So basically, whenever we feel something, we're receiving information from our sensory neurons. Now, on the other hand, motor neurons, that communicates information from our central nervous system to our muscles. So whenever we perform a certain movement, or lift a fork to eat dinner or something, that's actually our motor neurons that are doing that. And last but not least, here there's what's called interneurons. And those are basically communicate information from one neuron to another. They work amongst each other. So those are the three types of neurons to be aware of. Now, I did include this slide right here just to show you a little bit bigger so you can see this, here, but we have the cell body right here, and then we have the axon, which is this long part right here. That's kind of like an electrical wire where the impulse travels all the way through here. Then it reaches these branch-like things or finger-like things. Some people like to think of them that way. And those are called dendrites. And that's where they communicate to the next neuron. So that's just something to be aware of. Now, what's important about this too, there's one other term here called the myelin sheath. And that is the fatty substance that builds up around the length of the axon. And that usually occurs, that the more one repeats a certain type of movement or whatever, that actually builds up in the fatty substance around the myelin. It's called the myelin sheath, and that builds up around the axon, and that allows the signal to actually move a lot faster through, a lot more efficiently through the axon. So that's why the more we tend to practice a certain movement, we get better and faster at it. A couple other cells that we need to be aware of are called the glial cells. And those actually are some of the most abundant cells in our brain, 10 to 1, compared to neurons. And those support cells, and they actually provide structural support and nutrition to our neurons. They remove cell waste. So I'm going to stop there and explain that a little more in depth, because when we sleep at night, actually glial cells are what clear up all of the metabolic waste that occurs in our brain throughout the day, through our mental processes. It creates metabolic waste material. And so the glial cells actually help clean that out so our brains remain healthy. And last but not least, the glial cells, they actually manufacture that stuff that I referred to, that fatty substance that is called the myelin. And remember, that builds up what's called the myelin sheath around the axon and enables the signal to transfer much more efficiently and faster. And just as a reminder here, that says, that wraps around the myelin sheath, it wraps around axons and increases their communication speed. So something to be very aware of. And an overview of neural communication. So neurons, they communicate with each other, between each other, or amongst each other. And so that's something to know. And also within the neuron, so from the dendrite to the axon, so that's just something to be aware of. I don't expect you to memorize this 100%, but just to be aware of. Okay, so when the neuron, when it's what it happens is it needs to build up a certain amount of electrical charge in order to fire across the length of the axon. Well, before it builds up enough of the electrical impulse, that's actually called resting potential. And so you don't have to memorize all of this 100%, but usually in resting potential, there's like a negative 70 millivolts inside the cell. And so basically, there's potassium here. And so this is right here. This is a part of the axon right here. And then this, dissects it even further. And so we can take a look. So what happens is sodium ions, those can actually go inside the axon. And then it'll help to allow more of the potential to build up for that to fire. And when it does fire, that's actually called the action potential. So we got the resting potential and the action potential. Now here's the communication within the neuron. And so you remember I said, if the axon, if it needs to build up enough of the potential to fire, but if it does not, it just will not fire, and the transmission signal will not go along the length of the axon. So that's called the all or none action potential. So so please, feel free to stop the video, look at this a little more in depth, just to kind of look at this. But the main point of this slide right here is just to be aware of the all or none action potential. So either all of the potential needs to build up and eventually fire, or nothing will happen. All right, so now we're gonna continue about talking about communication between neurons. And so we have excitatory and inhibitory messages that the neurons receive. So all that means is when one neuron is communicating with the following neuron, when it's traveling in a chain, basically the transmitters can have different effects. And so what is called the excitatory message, that increases the likelihood that the postsynaptic neuron will activate. All postsynaptic means is the upcoming type of neuron that's receiving the message from the one that just fired. So that's called, and so the excitatory message, that will increase the likelihood that the next neuron will fire as well. If not, then it may experience what's called the inhibitory message, and that decreases the likelihood that the postsynaptic neuron will activate. This is just a quick diagram here of the process of synaptic transmission. So basically the neural impulse that fires, and then it travels along the length of the axon, and then it comes to dendrites, which actually transmit the signals to the dendrites of the following. Remember that was called the postsynaptic neuron. Okay, so the receiving neuron. And then it just shows you an enlarged view right here. So basically, it just the first neuron, it releases right here in the dendrites, basically what's called neurotransmitters. Okay, and so that's what's being released here into the receiving one. And then there's a little bit of a space in between those, and that's called the synaptic gap. And that's really all you need to know in this slide. Okay, so remember, I used the term neurotransmitter in the slide right before this, and a neurotransmitter is just basically a chemical messenger. And what's unique about neurotransmitters is each one has its own specific shape, just like these right here. And those actually fit in like a key going into a lock. And if they don't, then the receptor site here, whatever, won't fire. And so that's just something, communication won't occur. And this talks about the neurotransmitters and their effects, so feel free to pause the video and just take a look at this for further insight. Now we're going to talk about drugs and how they affect synaptic transmission. So why would we talk about drugs in synaptic transmission? Well, take for instance, if an individual is experiencing something like clinical depression, well then that person may receive a prescription, to receive, antidepressant medication. Well, those right there, the depressant medications, they actually are shaped like neurotransmitters, and they will determine whether the individual's brain actually receives the type of communication that's necessary in order to mitigate that type of depression. So these two words right here, antagonists, those are the type. Remember the neurotransmitters, they're shaped like a key going into a lock. Well, an antagonist, that's a poorly fit, type of receptor, and it blocks the transmitter. Whereas an agonist, that actually fits really well, the receptor really well, and acts like a transmitter. So that's important to keep in mind, those two terms, antagonists and agonists. So we're going to start taking a look at the central nervous system, and that's basically just refers to the brain and the spinal cord. And it's central to all of our behavior and our mental processes. All of that occurs in our central nervous system. So what I did here is I showed you a picture right here. I included this diagram, and the part that's in blue is the central nervous system right here. But all the other nerves that are shown going all the way throughout the rest of the body, all the way down to the feet, that's what's known as the peripheral nervous system, and that's shown in yellow right there. So I just want you to be aware of that and how that works. Now, another thing that's important to understand, what's the difference between a nerve and a neuron? And they're not the exact same, they're not the same things. So one thing to know is a nerve is a bundle of axons wrapped in a myelin sheath. And this is actually a cross section right here enlarged, so you see. So each one of these is an axon, and these are all bundled together to form what we usually refer to as our nerves. Moving on. So you remember a couple slides earlier I mentioned, the peripheral nervous system. And so I just want to talk about the autonomic nervous system. And that's the part that regulates our involuntary functions. So that's the stuff that comes natural, like our breathing, our heart rate, things like that. That is our autonomic nervous system. Whereas our two branches of our autonomic nervous system are the sympathetic nervous system, and that's the body's emergency system. That's what activates during fight or flight response. And then we have what's called the parasympathetic nervous system, and that conserves and maintains our physical resources. So the sympathetic nervous system, that's usually what kicks in when in a state of emergency or something suddenly happens that's threatening to us. Whereas more often than not, when we're in a restful state, a normal state, it's our parasympathetic nervous system that is engaged. So I just gave you some examples here, so the sympathetic nervous system, that's what this individual is experiencing. It kicks in when it sees, this snake. And so here's a lot of the things that happen during the sympathetic nervous system might do. Whereas the parasympathetic nervous system, that's when we feel relaxed. So you can see that this individual is relaxed, and starting to return to normal state right here. Okay, so the endocrine system, so there are different glands throughout our body that are comprise our endocrine system. And those glands, produce hormones involved in the stress response, and testosterone in males and females. Here's some examples, you don't have to memorize this explicitly. I just wanted to put this in so you become roughly aware of what the endocrine system is. And most important is just to know that the endocrine system, that it produces hormones throughout our body. And here's, some parts of the endocrine system right here. Feel free to pause the video and examine this. Okay, so we're going to start taking a look, at more specifically the human brain in and of itself. So, it's roughly, it's really not that big. It's roughly 2% of our body weight, but it uses 20% of our body's energy. And so that consists of many structures, all working together, which is known as an integrated system. And we'll take a look at some of those coming up. So, a couple of things, about brain damage risk first before we take a look at some others, examples. So, take for instance, in athletes, and especially football players, who receive a lot of impact, to their brains and stuff. Well, so that can cause concussions, and repeated concussions can result in what's called traumatic encephalopathy. So we just call it CTE for short. And so, definitely, there are manifestations of concussion, loss of consciousness, dizziness, blurred vision, double vision, slurred speech, memory loss, and cognitive impairment. So it's really important to keep that in mind when one is involved in contact type sports. Okay. Now, real quick, we're going to use some terms here: plasticity and neurogenesis. So neuroplasticity, that refers to the ability to change function and structure. So neuroplasticity, that's the brain's ability to change function and its structure. And so if it changes function, basically that's called functional plasticity. Structural plasticity, that's the brain's ability to change its own structure. And that occurs constantly throughout life. Now, neurogenesis is just the development of new neurons. And there are parts of the brain where it continues to do that throughout life. Not all parts of the brain, but there are parts of the brain where we can experience neurogenesis all the way until later phases of human development. So a couple things here just to keep in mind, the forebrain, that's in the part of the cerebral cortex, that is the frontal part of the brain. And so it has the outer covering of the forebrain, that's the cerebral cortex, that serves as primary communication link between left and right hemispheres in the brain. Okay, so another keep in mind here, remember the brain is divided into two hemispheres. Basically we just call it the left brain and the right brain. And that is connected by a part that's called the corpus callosum. That is right here, the corpus callosum. And that's what enables our left and our right brains to communicate to each other. So right here, here's like a hemisphere of the brain right here. And then this stuff right here in the middle, that connects this part of the brain to the other part of the brain. That's called the corpus callosum. So just a little bit of review there for you. Now, another important thing to know about the cerebral cortex is there are 4 lobes. The frontal lobe, which is basically concerned with basically, I would say, the primary motor cortex, as well as the the front part, like the executive functions, like planning, basically logical type thinking, stuff like that. That's all occurs in the frontal lobe. Now the parietal lobe right here, that is more concerned with receiving and sending sensory information throughout the brain and the body. Now back here, the occipital lobe, this is in the back of the brain. This actually is concerned with visual type processes and information. So even though our eyes are located roughly right around here, it actually the information that comes in through our eyes actually travels all the way to the back of our brain, to the occipital lobe, in order to be processed. And last but not least, we have what's called the temporal lobe right here. And that is usually concerned with auditory information. And auditory just means hearing. And you notice that is close to where the ears would be. Like, say, take, for instance, the ear might be right there. Okay, so we're going to take a look, at a couple things, like take, for instance, this gentleman right here, Phineas Gage, he was involved in a railroad type accident, many years ago. And this metal bar actually went right through his brain, right up through under his cheek and straight up through his brain and popped. And so that destroyed his left frontal cortex right in here, left part of the brain. And so what happened is he did not die, he actually got up and said, I'm okay, and was going to continue on with life. But little by little, his personality started to change, and his ability to plan for life and things like that changed as a result of the damage to the left frontal cortex right here. Okay, so a couple things here, and this is just for your own personal review, is the 4 lobes of the brain. We did go through those, so feel free to pause the video and take a look at these for more in-depth understanding and practice. Okay. Now, what's important about this right here is the limbic system, so what's the most important thing for us to think about right now is what's called the amygdala, and that's involved in memory and emotional response, especially fear, anger, that type of thing. So the amygdala, when we feel emotional responses such as fear and anger, we feel threatened or we're going to have to defend ourselves, that is actually our amygdala that's triggering that type of emotional response to a situation. Now, on this PowerPoint right here, what's important is this term right here. This is what I really want you to know, is the hippocampus. And that's involved in learning and forming new memories. That's the part of the brain that encodes all that new learning and new information, and actually sends that new information to parts of our brain to be stored as memory. So the hippocampus, and that can actually grow and shrink all throughout our lives depending on, how much we use our memories. So that's an important factor right there. This is just, a cross section of the brain showing you where some of these might be located. Please feel free to stop the video, and take a look at these if you want. I'm not going to test you necessarily on these where you have to memorize all these, but I just definitely want you to be aware of the amygdala and the hippocampus. Those are really important. Okay, here's just a look at some of the the areas of the part of the brain, the cortex is, and everything. I'm not going to have you memorize this, but I just wanted you to see this, for your own interests. Now, the word phrenology, that was just concerned with different parts of the brain and what those different parts of the brain, different regions of the brain, what they actually specialize in function-wise. So I just wanted to make you aware of that term phrenology. Okay, so finally, we're going to take a look at language. and the left hemisphere of the brain. So it was determined through phrenology that the left part of the brain is usually concerned with things like language. And so, this researcher right here, you don't have to memorize his name, but his name was Broca. And basically, he suggested that the area of the left brain, that area it eventually became called the Broca's region in the human brain, that area plays a crucial role in speech production. And so did this researcher right here named Carl Wernicke, right here. And so he determined that, and by looking at that part of the brain, he determined which part of the brain actually enabled patients, to speak quickly and easily. But he found out that their speech sometimes made no sense. They would speak gibberish. So if that part of their brain was actually damaged, they may speak quickly and easily, but they may actually speak gibberish, nonsensical type language. So here are the two parts of the brain, the Wernicke. And remember, if there's damage to that part of the brain, that it's, the person may be able to still speak, but they may speak gibberish. Whereas this part of the brain right here, the Broca's region or Broca's area, if damage to that part of the brain, then the patient might not be able to understand language whatsoever. So aphasia, that is this term right here, that's just the inability to articulate ideas or understand spoken or written language. So remember, Broca's aphasia, that means the inability to express, through language. Whereas Wernicke's aphasia, that's more concerned with receptive aphasia. And that means, that the individual may be able to process and okay, but when they're trying to express it, they may have an issue as well. So those are, can be closely related too. It's just to keep that in mind. And last but not least, I just put this in here for you to show you that here's the left hemisphere, and here's the parts of the brain that are generally associated with certain types of functions. And here's the right part of the brain, and here's the certain types of functions within those special hemispheres of the brain. So that concludes our discussion for Chapter 2. I realize that was a lot of information in a short amount of time, so I highly recommend you get your study guides out for this chapter. Begin to answer the questions to the best of your ability. Refer and review parts of this video, and then also definitely refer to Chapter 2 in your textbook, and please use your index in order to find certain terms, and that'll help you save time and go directly to the pages where you may need to find answers for your study guides. So good luck, and I will see you in later chapters.